Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to see all of you from CSSH Central in this Faculty Works in Progress workshop this afternoon. And it's just a couple of minutes in the afternoon. And it's a particular pleasure also to have our speaker, Ángel Nieves, give us insights into his exciting work today. I will turn without further ado to Tim Brown, who's going to introduce Ángel in greater detail. And then Ángel, just want to remind you to give us time for the discussion, please, as well. We are very eager to hear what you have to say. And of course, always love to have discussions as well. I want to also just mention that Ángel is next year going to be guiding the Humanities Center's conversations on reckonings through the fellowship program, which I think is a very exciting initiative of the Humanities Center. So I turn to Tim right now, and then I think Laurie will ultimately want to also remind all of us that this is an ongoing series and to urge all of you not just to come today to Ángel, but to come on a regular basis always. Laurie, if you don't mind, I turn to Tim then.
Thanks, Uda. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ángel David Nieves, Professor of Africana Studies, History, and Digital Humanities at Northeastern, Director of Public History in the History Department, and Director of Public Humanities in the college. We recently welcomed Dr. Nieves to Northeastern, and I can say without hyperbole that we're extremely happy indeed to have him. Dr. Nieves' scholarship focuses on the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and technology in the US and South Africa. He's the author and co-editor of 2 historical monographs, including An Architecture of Education, African American Women Design the New South, that's with University of Rochester Press, and We Shall Independent Be, African American Placemaking and the Struggle to Claim Space in the US, and that's with the University of Colorado Press. Dr. Nieves is in the vanguard of digital history and the use of virtual reality technology in historical reconstructions. His digital book project, Apartheid Heritages, A Spatial History of South Africa's Townships, brings together digital modeling, immersive technologies, and digital ethnography in the pursuit of documenting human rights violations in apartheid-era South Africa. In his role as Director of Public Humanities in CSSH, Dr. Nieves is helping to establish the History Department's program in public history with a broader remit, enabling some true interdisciplinary and interdepartmental conversations at Northeastern. And it's important to note in this connection that he's doing so with great attention to the pressing issues of race, inequality, and social justice that are motivating us at Northeastern. Dr. Nieves is a scholar, teacher, and administrator of immense energy, qualities which he combines with being extremely good-natured. And I know everyone who's had the pleasure of working with him so far is impressed by the aplomb with which he wears his multiple hats. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nieves to speak on the theme, The Spatial Histories of Anti-Apartheid Activism, the Soweto Uprising, and Critical Digital Platform Making. Dr. Ángel Nieves.
Can everyone hear me? Great. My thanks to Tim Brown, Chair of the History Department, for his kind introduction and his work to make digital history and social justice integral parts of our department's work. As Professor of History, Africana Studies, and Digital Humanities here at Northeastern, I am not advancing, sorry, for some reason.
I think you just need to click into the PowerPoint. There you are, or the, yep, there you are.
Oh, perfect, sorry, thank you. Yes, I do digital stuff, yes I do, yes I do. And as the former co-director of Hamilton College's Digital Humanities Initiative for almost a decade, I'm well aware of the many forms of labor and support it takes to make possible our inter, multi, and transdisciplinary cross-institutional programs and partnerships, including the Humanities Center that worked in partnership with the Office of the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. I want to personally thank Lori Lefkowitz, the Humanities Center's director, who has, As a new friend and colleague, despite our current situatedness, and please take that to mean in all its messy and many dimensions, has provided her support, her intellectual rigor, and a place for this transplanted Southern Californian by way of New Haven and New York to call home. Dean Uda Poiger has been tireless in her support of the public humanities and the public and digital humanities with a focus on how we might advance research and teaching in social and spatial justice. Gabby Fiorenza has been supportive and gracious with her time over the past several months, and I'm looking forward to working with Laurie and Gabby more closely and the new cohort of faculty and graduate students as part of this upcoming fall's Humanities Center theme on reckonings. This afternoon, I hope to weave together just two aspects of my book project for this Faculty Works in Progress talk. The first will provide a bit of an overview of my scholarship over the past 16 years in the US and South Africa, and my apologies to those of you who've heard some of this before, with a bit of the messiness, something I've spoken about in other contexts and in our forthcoming essay in an edited volume, The Digital Black Atlantic, as I work on finally gathering my thoughts on interface design. The second is a pragmatic attempt at developing a set of practices for a feminist and intersectional way forward for work in Black DH. Trained as an architect with a 5-year professional degree in architecture, an anthropologist, and an architectural historian of the Black experience, I got on board with digital scholarship early, and in particular since 2004, I've been traveling and researching in South Africa and have been working on a series of advocacy-driven digital humanities projects. 2 of them, here you're seeing the Social Justice Studio, something we've started up at Northeastern, and also the Soweto 76, a living digital archive while I was at the University of Maryland, that include community-driven participatory practices. I've been involved in a series of critical making projects that advocate for engaging my students and colleagues in digital scholarship around the messiness of archive making and the importance of documenting our process as scholars, and working to better reveal the processes of knowledge construction, tool and platform development, and our interdisciplinary research methods. I strongly believe that shifting our focus to process over product will make clear to many the real intellectual work of creating and making projects or scholarly tools in the digital humanities. I also believe we arrived at a significant turning point in the digital humanities and in digital scholarship more broadly, where we can now begin to radically change humanities-based research practices and offer new ways of documenting more specifically our intellectual labor using the internet. I'm also one of those academics who cannot easily separate everyday lived reality from activist and social justice-based pedagogies, the kind of activism that embraces the personal as political. And I'm often left to wonder how scholarly practice for some in the ivory tower is just what they do from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. Furthermore, as a DH practitioner who cannot ignore my own positionality as a queer scholar of color, I do not see a neat separation between my day-to-day lived reality from my digital practices. And as I write this talk, we are once again facing a global crisis, a pandemic brought on by COVID-19 that has impacted Black and Brown people here in the United States and across the African diaspora in disproportionate numbers. We might never know the full extent of the damage done by the pandemic because of the mishandling and willful neglect of the necessary data to more fully, both quantitatively and qualitatively, document its impact. The number of deaths reported in South Africa alone is now reaching 51,000, and the number of infections is over 1.5 million. I believe the numbers are grossly underreported by the ANC for a whole host of reasons. I was reminded of Joanna Drucker's somewhat dated 2012 essay, Humanistic Theory and Digital Scholarship, in which she warns humanists to be acutely aware of the ways that technologies don't often share the values espoused by the humanities. She writes, the cultural authority of digital technology is still claimed by the fields that design the platforms and protocols on which we work. These are largely fields in which quantitative, engineering, and computational sensibilities prevail. Tools for humanities work have evolved considerably in the last decade, but during that same period, a host of protocols for information visualization, data mining, geospatial representation, and other research instruments have been absorbed from disciplines whose epistemological foundations and fundamental values are at odds with or even hostile to the humanities. Positivistic, strictly quantitative, mechanistic, reductive, and literal, these visualizations and processes and techniques preclude humanistic methods from their operations because of the very assumptions on which they are designed. The objects of knowledge can be understood as self-identical, self-evident, ahistorical, and autonomous. End of quote. Drucker asks that we develop a critique of platforms, understand the protocols of operating systems, and how programming is resistant and often incompatible to the qualitative approaches we value so deeply in the humanities. As a humanist who's been deeply involved in the creation of front and back end design, the use of content management systems, in making archives at Hamilton, where we used Fedora, Islandora, and Drupal at the core of our sustainable practices in platform design, I've remained committed to finding new ways of harnessing software and tools available on the internet for empowering communities to tell their own stories. More recently, Tara McPherson's Feminist as a Software Lab shows how Unix as a series of operating systems prompted a kind of modernist modularity in thinking that fostered an approach to race and gender that, quote, is more additive than integrative or relational, end of quote. For McPherson, new, quote, conceptual models for the digital humanities and for digital media studies are needed that could help us attend to software, code, databases, and more in ways that push beyond modularity and that help us understand that these digital objects and systems exert their own agencies even as they also emerge from culture, end of quote. So developing new forms of practice and research methods that outline an integral feminist and intersectional framework, and here I mean not a sprinkle and add a race or gender analysis here or there, in the design of publication platforms is something that I've been working to make possible since 2004. However, I will, for the sake of this talk, make clear that I'm committed to community-engaged archive making and feminist storytelling practices in the hopes that they can begin to bring about social justice. My work documenting the student uprisings in Soweto began 16 plus years ago with a prototype I developed entitled Soweto 76, a living digital archive, during my tenure as a faculty fellow at the Maryland Institute for Technologies and the Humanities. Soweto 76 was at the time our initial prototype for an online multimedia archive of the holdings of Johannesburg's Hector Peterson Memorial and Museum. Combining available oral histories, testimonies, historic photographs, video footage, material objects, and sound recordings from the Hector Peterson Memorial Museum, the work sought to redress the existing negative portrayal of the lives of township residents in the mainstream or official historical record by adding the voices of women who were activists during the anti-apartheid struggle. The beta version for the prototype was completed in 2008. At the time, we were working on a large-scale grant through Atlantic Philanthropies that would have helped us both develop a series of tools and provide the training for their use through heritage organizations in Johannesburg, South Africa, in partnership with township organizations. Unfortunately, the global housing crisis derailed our plans for that large-scale project because Atlantic Philanthropies needed to divert monies to endangered organizations that would be forced to close because of the economic meltdown in late 2008. In 2008, it was also not possible to publish interactive or robust 3D models using web viewers such as Internet Explorer or Firefox. Chrome had not yet been fully deployed and was only available for Microsoft Windows. At the same time, I'd already been working with the Soweto 76 Student Foundation, made up of former student activists who were involved in the uprisings. The foundation sought to address what they had long felt were extant silences in the historical record about the role of women and girls on that day in June of 1976, something they were very much looking to address over the short term as they sought to preserve endangered archival holdings and supplement them over the long term with a series of new digital multimodal narrative interventions. A digital archive in South Africa as a construct and as an architecture of knowledge remains highly problematic because South African records and archives still serve, even some 27 plus years after the dismantling of the apartheid state, as tools for both oppression and liberation. What were once extant holdings in the National Archives related to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of the late 1990s have recently been lost or destroyed purposefully in an effort to erase those records of human rights violations that remain unanswered or where amnesty was granted, is still seen as a way of covering up actual untold truths about past crimes. Much of this work also considers how transmedia, quote, as an approach to the production of cultural and creative content where narratives are constructed to extend across multiple platforms and to offer varying entry points for audiences. end quote, might be used to advance a social justice agenda. For media studies scholar Jenny Kidd, transmedia, quote, refers to the webs of elaborate content which can be unearthed by and co-produced with audiences who are looking for more sophisticated interactions with narratives than might have been available to them in the past. Core to the transmedia approach is the provision of opportunities for immersion, play, curiosity, and spreadability, radical intertextuality, and multimodality, end of quote. Through this work, I'm attempting to build an online 3D digital publication that might provide a more radical intertextuality to our understanding of the anti-apartheid struggle through the voices of women and school-age youth from the 1970s and 80s in South Africa. Over the past 2 decades, scholars and community leaders have experimented with the use of new digital technologies to tell the complex histories of the anti-apartheid movement. Technologies now at our disposal allow us to layer victim testimony using online platforms and multiple tools for mapping, text mining, and 3D visualizations. Architectural reconstructions of sites where apartheid-era crimes occurred can now be used to document more complex histories of the liberation movement. As a field, digital humanities can also help analyze new forms of documentation so as to reconstruct and recover an alternative historical narrative in the face of conventional wisdom or officializing histories crafted solely for the foreign tourist market by the local provincial government or the African National Congress nationally. The book project is on track to be published both in analog, a paper-based version of the online artifact, and a digital form by Stanford University Press. Apartheid Heritages brings together, as Tim suggested earlier, 3D modeling, immersive technologies, and digital ethnographic methods of witness to document the long history of human rights violations within the unique urban landscape of Soweto. In particular, the project looks at 4 interconnected historical events or moments in the township's development: the prehistory of 2 Iron Age sites there, the founding of Soweto in 1904, the student uprisings of 1976, and the death of gay 14-year-old anti-apartheid activist in 1988-1989. The work documents the longue durée, or a long-term history of a place. And here I'm looking at a place that we would later call Soweto. And I will say that it's heavily influenced by Ferdinand Brauddel's writing in the Mediterranean and by my alma mater, Binghamton University, where the Ferdinand Braudel Center is actually located. Here I'm deploying the digital as a tool for constructing new forms of historical inquiry through the study of place and placemaking. As a first step towards realizing apartheid heritages, beginning in January 2018, I was co-principal investigator on a grant looking to see the feasibility of a joint 3D edition publishing protocol awarded by the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, or the NHPRC, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. A successful 3D scholarly edition would provide users reliable academic source materials within the context of a 3-dimensional virtual environment, such as reconstruction of a cultural heritage site or a historical event. In addition to the processes and apparatus of traditional academic publishing, 3D scholarly editions would also accommodate the range of technologies used by digital studies scholars who work in spatial history to answer specific research questions and provide mechanisms to embed academic argumentation and deep annotations within a virtual online space. A 3D scholarly edition is uniquely digital because it allows for the publication of interactive, richly annotated and multimodal virtual world experiences that cannot be reproduced in traditional print form. Because our work on this grant, because of the work on this grant-funded project, we have now been able to provide a more stable publication platform for publishing 3D interactive content online. And as of this January, the Scalar platform now allows for Unity embedded content to be part of a richly annotated and multimodal book-length narrative. This was not previously possible, except for the Fulcrum online publishing platform developed by the University of Michigan. And this now allows for an array of fields, including architectural history, classics, archaeology, art history, and others, to incorporate highly interactive 3D content in long-form narratives. Our work on the Scalar platform now also allows me to consider the micro scale by looking at the house or home as the primary spatial unit of analysis for the overall project, while also providing new ways of annotating spaces using the methods of spatial history. I'm incredibly proud of my project collaborators, Eric Lawyer, Craig Dietrich, and John Buckley on these advancements. My efforts to document Soweto spatial relations using an intersectional and feminist analytical framework have not been attempted before in a book-length monograph. And here I want to make clear that the nomenclature of the analog book is something I'm struggling to name. If anyone has some insights in naming the sort of transmedia digital narratives I'm describing, those that aren't neatly labeled as chapters found in an analog book publication, I'd be happy to hear your insights. For now, I'm using Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the assemblage because it was both always concerned about questions of power and that it described an ongoing process rather than a static situation. Their use of assemblage asserts that, quote, there is only one reality, but that reality is multiple in and of itself, and we need conceptual tools like assemblage to disentangle it and render visible its constitutive threads. End quote. For me, an assemblage of narratives and narrative forms allows for the kind of messiness I've been trying to capture digitally in the histories of Soweto. Much like historian Phil Effington's work for Ghost Metropolis, who in his work on Los Angeles since 13,000 BP provides its history into 9 regional regimes, the incorporation of multiple scales of spatial and historical analysis through micro and macro historical reconstructions in my own work helps to virtually recreate the detailed histories of the local, domestic, and residential in Soweto's unique race-based spatial history. My work has raised a number of issues for me and what I consider to be some of the core values that are needed today when working in digital humanities, both in feminist and Black DH. Values that for many scholars in the larger DH community came to the forefront just last summer. I've been especially informed by feminist and intersectional epistemologies, and my research with feminists of color go back to my graduate thesis in anthropology at Binghamton and my research to document the history of Black women housing reformers organized around the New Orleans housing developments in the pre-Hurricane Katrina days. I was also a signatory of an earlier call to action in Black DH known as the E-Black Studies Manifesto, sponsored by the African American Studies Department of the University of Illinois at Urbana in 2008, that defines E-Black Studies, quote, as the ongoing application of current digital information technology towards the production, dissemination, and collection of historical knowledge critical to the discipline of Black studies into the overall Black experience, end of quote. The authors, of whom I was just 1 out of 15, outline 9 imperatives to guide and grow the fledgling discipline. Some 12 years later, we've grown E-Black Studies significantly despite daunting challenges faced during the economic crisis of that same year and the subsequent global recession. E-Black Studies matured and grew significantly as a result of a great many of those initial 16 scholars into what we now consider to be Black DH. That particular history is one I hope to expand upon in a future historiographic deep dive into the earlier intersections between the field of African American studies and digital technologies. After the events of last year, the so-called woke summer, with widespread protests against militarized racism and authoritarianism, conversations about social justice are widespread across academia, and critical Black DH practice becomes ever more imperative. So I want us to consider for a minute the feasibility of a feminist Black DH recovering the lives of Black women such as these, including Sarji Bartman, Anna Julia Cooper, Charlotte Makeki, Victoria Orr Matthews, Antoinette Sidhull, Pauline Hopkins, and Winnie Madikizela Mandela. For many of you today, these names may mean very little. For others, these women were pioneers, women who could conceivably even be designated Afrofuturists, women who seemingly anticipated the urgency of the DH debates we're currently having during these inequitable pandemic-ridden times, who looked at progress, social change, and world building in Black communities well before others of their day. If Black Lives Matter across academia as a scholar of race and gender in the built environment, I could not help but have Black women's lives matter to me also. In the US and South Africa, the lives of Black women and racial uplift have always been critical, but have never been properly valued, documented, or recognized. Black women's lives matter in both of these geopolitical contexts because of the labor they contributed in the making of the empire of both the English in colonial America and the Dutch in the Cape Colony of Southern Africa. These histories cannot continue to be ignored, erased, overlooked, or silenced without making certain of the many contributions that were made at great personal and collective costs by so many Black and brown women. These same women who ultimately found ways to begin dismantling the legacy of settler colonialism. These histories are unique in many significant ways, but the tools of white supremacy, racial capitalism, and genocide are very much the common thread that stitches these living tableaus together. I remind you what Audre Lorde once wrote. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. Racism and homophobia are real conditions of all our lives in this place and time. I urge each one of us here to reach down into that deep place of knowledge inside herself and touch that terror and loathing of any difference that lives here. See whose face it wears. Then the personal as the political can begin to illuminate all of our choices. End of quote. So what is possible when those of us who have been the victims of racial hatred, violence, and segregation learn to harness the master's tools? I urge us to consider a new way forward for a Black DH that as a social movement and as a political project, once again challenges the still white dominated field of digital humanities without hesitation or apology, and is unapologetic about its commitment to racial justice. Black DH, as Moya Bailey, Kim Gallen, Jessica Marie Johnson, and Rupika Rizm have argued elsewhere, should be simultaneously experimental, analytical, computational, speculative, and have unique design capabilities as a series of practices and in the shaping of the field's future. In response, we've already seen large-scale efforts, often funded by foundations outside the academy, to address the kind of disciplinary focus of and adherence to the dominant fields and tools created in support of a very Eurocentric focused model for digital humanities, something we continue to see at our yearly International Association of Digital Humanities Organizations conference, with significant pushback from our European colleagues who disavow race as a legitimate category of analysis or humanistic inquiry. I would argue that given the recent turn in digital humanities scholarship that grows out of discussions about the intersectional contours of a critical DH, I would add that a great deal of that blurriness has happened because of the emergence of new work by scholars of color. For example, here I'm thinking about Safiya Noble's Algorithms of Oppression or Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, who most frequently work at those very junctions between and among various forms of representation, acts of erasure from the historical record, and in community-based practices that work to engage many publics. Fortunately, we've been able to break free from that white male-centered, heteronormative, overtly text-based, monolingual analytical focus, that's a mouthful, making significant inroads through DH 2018 in Mexico City and other interventions across the Americas, the Caribbean, and digital projects that readily engage with racial justice, including the African American History, Culture, and Digital Humanities program at the University of Maryland College Park, the Colored Conventions Project at Penn State, the Forum on Digital Ethnic Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and the History of Black Rioting at the University of Kansas-Lawrence. Northeastern has long been invested in communities of difference and the ways that digital humanities can be reshaped by scholarly commitments to social justice theories and practice across a number of programs and departments. In part, I'm kind of speaking to the converted, but the Boston Research Center, the Digital Scholarship Group, the NU Lab, and our special collections and university archives at Snell Library, and the departments and programs across CSSH, including other colleges and schools at the university, have all made significant long-term structural changes in our curriculum and in our hiring priorities of new colleagues, from assistant to full professors to support DH scholarship, something that sets us apart from many other R1 institutions across the Northeast. Each of these institutions is making significant progress in training students and modeling the kind of scholarship that is currently needed to address racial and systemic inequalities in digital humanities. With institutional support and alliances with one or two senior faculty who have also leveraged their positions in their respective fields along with their reputations, Black DH is becoming more mainstream. However, it is still seen at many institutions as too niche or a result of digital faddism, or worse, is the subject to the pressures of a class of neoliberal administrators seeking new funding streams for embattled Black, African American, and Africana Studies programs at our departments. Rectifying the financial and socio-political imbalance of Black, African American, and Africana Studies programs or departments must come along with the full embrace of digital humanities, but not without the support of the breadth of subfields and subdisciplines that make up most of those programs. All this still impedes a clear way forward for Black DH, and by extension, a feminist DH, whose history is not linked to white feminism without some sort of agreed upon set of practices, community building strategies, and new knowledge making frameworks. Keeping the above in mind, I'm going to suggest some practices for work going forward in DH, and these to include opportunities to promote collaborative models of teaching and research, while also understanding that collaboration requires a very different conception of project timelines, workflows, deliverables, and expectations when undertaking Black DH, and DH that respects and values the DH of the marginalized. As this DH promotes and recovers the voices of the marginalized, I urge it also to promote an ethics of care and collaboration as it interrogates why power, privilege, and access remain a series of repressive interconnected technologies in and of themselves. Therefore, much like the E-Black Studies Manifesto, I too propose a set of key practices for Black DH projects, a manifesto that may resonate with other DH practices of the marginalized. However, I propose that specifically we in the Black DH community consider these 10 principles of practice. And I'm only going to highlight a couple of them because of time and so that we can have a more conversation. I'd like to sort of focus on the fourth, to study power, privilege, and access as a series of interconnected technologies that have been used to disempower marginalized and Black communities narratives and forms of cultural production, and require a different way forward for practicing DH, understanding how power and how best to address power relations as one of these we might want to focus on. And I want to look actually at the 10th here. And centering and immediately prioritizing Black women and queer voices in Black DH as another sort of major goal. I'm happy to share out the list of goals here. I know I've gone through them a bit quickly, and I'm actually almost done. Finding ways of bridging lived realities while also attempting to articulate some guidelines for doing the work of a feminist in Black DH, and embracing the phrase "the personal is political" is worthy of discussing and debating further, but only as to those next actionable steps. Inaction is not acceptable. Pearl clutching, hand wringing, and talking things to their untimely demise can no longer be the default. Instead, institutions of higher education must pivot from their dependence on soft money support on external monies that do not necessarily seed long-term pedagogical change, and instead begin now to endow student and community-based Black DH practices. It is said that for every crisis, there exists also an opportunity. Today's pandemic and economic downturn mark exactly the right moment to make these steps part of every institution's new set of priorities over the next decade. And I'm excited to work on those steps here at Northeastern. I look forward to our forthcoming conversation. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Ángel, thank you for that. You accomplished so much in this short space of time. And I also want to personally thank you for coming onto the Northeastern scene as such a force so quickly, assuming so many responsibilities. And so I want to thank you both for being a force and for your just talent at academic friendship. It's so evident. I'm happy to field questions, call on people who visually raise your hand or put RTS into the chat. We're all in a virtual room together, so we can hear your voices. Ángel, I will start us off while we're waiting for people, because if every bit of this is interesting and path-breaking, and much of it is new for me, but early on you spoke about the feminist storytelling enterprise and the need for recovering women's stories. And I'm wondering if that's the same thing, and if not, if it's something more than adding women's voices, if you could say more about what a feminist storytelling enterprise is. And I also love the idea of assemblage and thinking about, maybe that has something to do with a feminist storytelling enterprise, and thinking about maybe other perhaps better or more precise locutions than assemblage. But it did make me think, I know we're wary of falling back on old white feminist models, of Clément and Irigaray and Sixou, and the ways in which those early French feminists rejected the linearity of a certain kind of logic that they associated with male sexuality, actually, and the advocating for a kind of, women write with white ink model of storytelling that I feel never actually got the kind of attention that it deserved or became productively channeled into what might have been feminist storytelling as an enterprise. So yeah, that's my question.
Lori, that's a great question, a great series of questions. I'm going to try to unbundle a couple of the elements there and try to respond. One of the ways in which these feminist storytelling practices divert ever so slightly from just the ways we might incorporate these alternative narratives of women is actually in the process of the gathering of those stories. I think process is really an important part of what I'm trying to outline and an important part of what I'm also trying to make visible in the larger project. Much to my editor's dismay, I am trying to do more of the under the hood sort of reveal of the projects that we undertake, but also what are the steps that we can sort of put forward in working in a community-based model that actually empowers women to gather these stories themselves and to provide that kind of training for that kind of work. And so I think that in part is a little bit of a skew on just getting these narratives and having them be a part of the historical record. And I'm not familiar with the early French, these French women storytellers that you mentioned, which is probably the problem or part of the problem in our own histories. And I think going back to those elements of feminist work that we can remix, reassemble, use as part of this assemblage kind of idea is important and critically needed. So I'm excited about this area that I could potentially also borrow some language from and some ideas. But it is a work in progress. I'm trying to figure out how to outline all these many steps while also telling the story.
Oh, well, glad for the excuse for a cup of coffee with you, Uta.
Hi, Angel. Yeah, this was very, very enlightening, very ambitious, and in a sense, I think really a call to action for the age and for the humanities more broadly. I will just be honest with you that I was hoping that at some point we would get a little demonstration, and so I'm wondering whether we need to schedule another time, because I'm of course struck by the focus that you have on the spatial, including, there you alluded to, in fact, spaces of home is particularly important for the Soweto project. And of course, the long history of gender, the space, public, private, again, always more complicated than some theories would allow us to understand. And at the same time, of course, really, really find very important your insistence on building archives through community engagement. And so maybe this is not the time, and I'm sure we can't get you to do visualizations, but I just wonder whether in one little snippet you would allow us a look under the hood for Soweto in particular, perhaps something that you are building there that is paradigmatic of the values that you urged us all to embrace, right? Of intersectionality, of community engagement, of really making the digital important to recovery, but also new understanding of past and present at the same time.
Uta, thank you for that. One of the challenges we've had is the platform is a little bit buggy because we're still sort of working out some of the kinks. And so it isn't quite ready for prime time. My announcement was more that we've made the technology happen and we're still sort of futzing with it. And I think this is, again, my own as much as I espouse the theory of process over product, I sometimes worry about showing things being a little too buggy because it may take away from the power of the.
Angel, I thought I understood that you weren't going to do that because otherwise you would have done it already. So what I really asked for is just a bit more narrative around a paradigmatic example, so that we could perhaps locate what you were saying somewhat more in the Soweto. So I'm completely ready not to get the 3D animation of the homes. I'm not quite sure. As you can tell, my imagination was inspired by the little snippets, but no, I was really asking for sort of a narratively constructed example by you, just so I, as someone who's not in these spaces all the time, can understand more deeply.
So the larger project takes on the challenge of looking at narrative at different levels, and a way that it does this is not just through Scalar as the primary sort of narrative device that gives you that sort of history that you can sort of see, but what sort of takes it into a completely different direction, and one that engages narrative and narrative parts in other ways, is actually going into the model and then being able to access these annotations that provide a deeper kind of history. And I use this as just a fast way of thinking about it. It's kind of like a Wikipedia on steroids in terms of how the annotations work, because they not only provide more textual historical depth, but you actually can access in these annotations the archival objects that also help to tell that part of the story from the annotations. And part of what we're also challenged by is the use of hyperlinking to and from various parts of not only the narrative, but how we then connect the spaces of the model back to those annotations and back to the main sort of story. So it's got a lot of moving pieces and parts, and we're trying to, right now we've got, I don't know, 40 or 50 of these annotations in process, and I'm working on a bunch of others, and we don't know at what point we need to sort of stop working on annotations, because you can annotate the heck out of this. And so finding where the boundaries are between the annotative kind of narrative and the broader textual narrative is where a lot of my thinking has been. And hence why I also thought that this talk would be better as a kind of intellectual history a bit of sort of the challenges of platform making, because I've never really talked about it in any kind of depth. And so here was my chance, here is the chance to sort of talk about it a bit more.
Thank you.
Thank you, Uda.
Hi, that was fabulous, Anel. Thank you so much. So strangely enough, I'm not going to ask a feminist question, which, you know, might be the first for me here, even though it is International Women's Day. So hello, everybody. But my question has to do, because you sort of raised the issue about the trendiness of DH, which, you know, is a fact. And so I wonder what you think, if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the relationship between these kinds of invested political DH projects that are, you know, race and gender engaged and cognizant, and for want of a better phrase, I don't know, older school projects that are invested in the same kinds of questions, about racial and gender justice, but that, you know, kind of do it in the old ways. And, you know, because I do think as DH has become so trendy, both getting money, and every school wants to have one, and it's what gets touted all the time now, you know, the relationships between the kinds of critical gender and race scholarship that's gone on for decades, you know, before the damn internet, right? And the DH stuff is unclear to me. And, you know, not to be paranoid here, but I am, you know, the concern that, you know, as this becomes, as the DH takes over, you know, and eats everything alive, that those other critical projects will somehow be seen as less critical. And I mean critical in both ways, less, less important and less critical in terms of their interrogation of those regimes of power.
It's a great question, Susanna. I think it's one of the misconceptions of what it is that DH is trying to do. I think it's trying to harness a generation of new scholars on the ground that are familiar with technologies and have a bit of ease with its use, because they are also telling some very unique and interesting stories. I don't know that DH is necessarily going to take over, but what I do envision and have envisioned from building centers and building a major center, a small liberal arts college, is that in fact, we've all been involved in one way or another in the digital because of the advent of the internet. And I think there are not just more ways of getting information, but there are more and perhaps some interesting critical ways of taking the analysis into a different level that's allowed by doing the digital. And so I don't see it replacing or sort of sidelining at all more old school kind of scholarship, because I think it's all very much informed and is just, I think, a natural evolution of where it's going to sort of be in many ways. I think the biggest disruption has been acknowledging the problem of the book as a insurmountable, cost-effective strategy that has always challenged university presses in particular. And we need to find new ways of making the scholarship available, and just to sort of reveal how it is that we do all of this new and old school stuff. So I really do see it as an opportunity. And I think the biggest disruption has been the challenge that some have felt by, oh, it's going to replace the book. And, quite frankly, I don't see that as happening. And I'll use the example of South Africa in particular. How do we sort of address the inequities, the digital divide when it comes to access to electricity, to computational power, to machines? And so there has to be an analog in some way that responds to, all of the folks that I've interviewed, they should walk away with something. It shouldn't just be completely reliant on some digital device. So finding those negotiations, and I think that's actually where the more exciting work of publishing today is. How do we find those mediated sort of transactions between the analog and the digital? But I'm so old school, and maybe I have one foot in the old school and one foot in the new, but I can't see us doing the work that we do without a deep investment in the methodologies that make up what the humanities is. So I sort of struggle with it, and it's a great question. I kind of struggle with, just making more visible that there are new opportunities for what the digital provides, and a whole host of other challenges that it brings to the table. Great question, thanks.
I hope there are more questions among you. It's great to see so many people here. While we wait, in case they're, for people to gather their thoughts, I worry over making a distinction between old and new, and digital and classic. I think we need to find a way, a vocabulary that doesn't binarize that these developments, and that feels very important to me. And maybe there's something to be said for materiality, that you can bring us to Soweto virtually, but we need to also bring our bodies there and engage with the humans who are, something about materiality and our embodiedness, and how the digital can be a bridge to those things, but can never actually replace the digital archives and material objects can't be dichotomized. I mean, we need to get from from the image of the thing to the thing itself, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think in some of the ways I don't like to talk about it in terms of old and new, because then I don't really know where I sit in relation to that. But I do like to have the conversation be about the technologies, and technologies in its broadest sense, right? So that we understand that the book is a technology, we understand that knowledge production is a technology, we understand that, you know, the kind of advocacy and social justice work we do is also a kind of technology, and sort of understanding those longer histories. And I think because I take this work all the way back to these Iron Age sites, I think a materiality about a particular place is so important, and such an integral part of this, and it can never sort of substitute for that lived experience. But I think it provides a window for adding more complicated stories is really what I'm kind of after. And tackling the materiality is a hard one, but something I think that you know, is worthy of further debate and discussion.
Thanks, Angel. Liza, we'll give you the last question, and then I'll ask all of you if you would to wait a minute or so, not more, for me to just tell you what's upcoming in the Works in Progress series. Liza.
Thanks, Lori. It's a big question, so obviously I don't expect you to fully answer this in the last few minutes. But as you talk about, you know, making these stories more complex, and you talk about the annotation that's involved in this, I'm thinking about the struggle between sort of completeness of the methodology and its usefulness as a tool for advocacy, and where how those two things can be brought together. And I wondered if you could, you know, specifically talk about the Soweto 76 project, and how community residents, or you know, either residents of Soweto or, you know, broader South African political activists and advocates can utilize these tools in making claims in their contemporary work.
Thanks, Liza. That's a really important part of the work, and one of the challenges and why I also am so invested in trying to find different avenues for how the stories get consumed, is that, in fact, and I think you and I have talked a little bit about this in terms of India, is the sort of widespread use of the cell phone as a technology, or the smartphone as a technology that can provide another way into these narratives, but I think also as a way to embrace sort of the incompleteness of what I'm kind of talking about, and the additive nature. And we've talked a lot about this, actually. I've talked a lot about this with the press, and how we might continue to actually, once the book reaches a level of completeness, whatever that happens to be, how do we then continue to build on it by continuing that work with community engaged partners that add even more material to it, and add their own stories that they are then collecting in ways that you know, may not be readily or easily available to me. I think COVID sort of makes that you know, a very much needed strategy. But I also think that that level of incompleteness is something that also allows for the work of community engagement, because the stories are always shifting, and the relativity of what we sort of understand to be the truths around certain events allows us to get at more of those alternative narratives, more at those sort of squishy places in sort of storytelling and narrative gathering that don't always align with one another, but the conversations around those misalignments, or the lack of alignment between what is sort of perceived to be the truth versus, let's say, what the apartheid government recorded or attempted to record, is in part where that richer kind of spot is, that I'm hoping we can sort of find a way to sort of bring forward. And maybe using smartphones as one of those tools could be the way into gathering more of that messy stuff. but I'm definitely going to have to talk to you about this more.
Ángel, thank you. I love that word messy. And as someone with long attachment to the evolution of narrative and narrative theory, yes, thank you, Laura. Applause to you, Ángel. I mean, this is really exciting to me and it's tremendously ambitious. And I thank you. It's just really wonderful. So thank you all for being here. We are actually far along in our semester. There are 2 more faculty works in progress to look forward to, and both represent larger enterprises of the humanities and various centers of the College of Social Science and Humanities. So I hope you will mark your calendars and encourage your colleagues to attend. The next of them is the last in the series of presentations from this year's fellows on disruption and displacement. That will be Monday at this time at noon. Bring your lunches for Monday at noon, March 22nd. And the 2 presenters are Danny Faber from Sociology and Laura Kuhl, and they'll wrap up our sense of what the fellows have accomplished this year. It's really been a wonderful group, and we're so delighted that Ángel himself will be assuming leadership of facilitating next year's group on reckonings. And finally, Monday, April 5th, also at noon, we will hear from Gretchen Hefner and Philip Tai, who have contributed one of the modules to this tremendously impressive pandemic teaching initiative. That's a collaborative effort. I would really like to see that initiative get more attention. I hope that this final presentation will begin to drive us to the website and to the work of our colleagues. That presentation is called Disease, Diplomacy, and Science in the Cold War, Lessons for Future Pandemics. May there not be any, but I would hope that you could come on April 5th as well. And since I have your ears, I hope that some of you will join us later today at 5 o'clock for the annual Ruderman lecture, which this year is on trauma, the Jewish experience, and lessons for post-COVID mental health. We have 3 very distinguished speakers. That's at 5 o'clock, and you can register easily through the Jewish Studies website. Ángel, bravo. Thank you all my colleagues for being here, and I look forward to seeing you in person before too long.